There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They wear the camouflage of a Tuesday night, the quiet hum of a refrigerator, the mundane weight of a body slumping against yours in sleep. You don't recognize them as architecture, as the load-bearing walls of a future you can't yet imagine. They are simply moments, passing through you like breath. It's only later, when you look back from a great distance, that you see them for what they were, the silent, unceremonious laying of a foundation, the first stone placed in the ground of what would eventually become home. For me, that moment smelled of laundry detergent and day-old coffee, and it felt like the impossibly warm, trusting weight of Caleb's head on my shoulder. He was a continent of sleep beside me, a landscape I had spent the better part of a year mapping in secret. I knew the cartography of his breathing, the slow, deep draft of true rest versus the shallow, fitful rhythm of a mind still turning over the day's anxieties. I knew the exact point where the dark stubble on his jaw softened into the skin of his neck, and the way a single muscle in his hand would twitch just before he settled into the deepest part of his sleep. These were the details of a forbidden study, observations collected from the periphery, from the safe and painful distance of a friendship that felt both as vast as an ocean and as constricting as a locked room. But tonight, on our worn-out gray couch, with some forgotten documentary murmuring from the television, the distance had collapsed. It had evaporated without warning, leaving me in the epicenter of a quiet, terrifying warmth. My entire world had shrunk to the points of contact. The solid pressure of his shoulder against mine, the fine hairs on his arm brushing against my own, the soft puff of his breath ghosting across the fabric of my t-shirt. I was a photographer by trade, a man who made his living by framing the world, by controlling the light and the distance, by capturing moments without ever truly being in them. I was always behind the lens, an observer, a ghost in the machine of other people's lives. But here, now I was pinned. I was part of the composition, a crucial element in this still life of domestic intimacy, and I had no idea what to do. My own breathing was a treacherous thing, a shallow and unreliable tide I was desperately trying to control, terrified that any sudden movement, any hitch in the rhythm, would wake him. Waking him felt like it would be a kind of sacrilege, a shattering of a fragile, sacred peace. Waking him would mean he would pull away, and the warmth would recede, and the yawning chasm of our unspoken reality would open up between us once more. So I sat there, a statue carved from longing and fear, and I let him sleep. I had met Caleb Jacobs in the most transactional of ways, through a listing on a roommate finder website. My previous roommate had moved to another state to follow a job and a girl, leaving me with a beautifully sunlit, prohibitively expensive two-bedroom apartment and a looming sense of panic. The listing I posted was dry, practical, full of phrases like young professional and clean and respectful, and no overnight guests without prior discussion. It was a document designed to attract someone stable and boring, someone who would pay their half of the rent on time and leave no trace of their existence. It was not designed to attract Caleb. His reply was a single, breezy line. "Hey, I'm Caleb. I'm not a serial killer, and I do my own dishes. When can I see the place?" He arrived at my door looking like he had just stepped out of a magazine ad for a life I would never lead. He was tall, with the easy, grounded posture of a former athlete, and a smile that seemed to physically generate its own light. He moved with a kind of casual confidence that I, in all my carefully constructed, quiet introversion, found both fascinating and deeply intimidating. He had been a Division I soccer player in college, a fact he mentioned not as a boast, but as a simple statement of personal history, like telling me where he grew up. Now he was a software consultant, a job that seemed to involve a lot of travel, a lot of important-sounding phone calls, and a wardrobe of crisp button-down shirts that always looked effortlessly perfect on him. He walked through the apartment, his presence immediately filling the spaces my previous roommate had left empty. He noted the good light in the spare bedroom, complimented my framed photographs on the walls, and declared the kitchen workable for a man of my limited culinary talents. Within 20 minutes, he had offered to take the room, and I, despite every instinct telling me that living with someone so incandescently alive would be a daily exercise in feeling my own dimness, had agreed. Our friendship, in the beginning, was a thing of convenience and proximity. It was built in the small, shared moments of cohabitation. The morning nods over the coffee maker, the debates over whose turn it was to buy toilet paper, the shared takeout containers eaten on the floor while we waited for our dining table to be delivered. He was an external force, a whirlwind of social energy. His friends, a boisterous and loyal crew of former teammates, would sometimes fill our living room with laughter and the clinking of beer bottles. He had a girlfriend, Sarah, a sharp, ambitious lawyer who was as polished and confident as he was. They were a perfect set, two matching pieces of beautiful, expensive luggage. I would watch them from the quiet harbor of my room, listening to the murmur of their conversations, the easy cadence of their life together. I was the silent partner in the lease, the background character in the story of his life. And I was fine with that. Or, at least, I told myself I was. My own life was a quieter affair. My work as a freelance photographer sent me on solitary journeys through the city, hunting for texture and light, for the overlooked narratives hidden in the cracks of the urban landscape. My world was one of darkrooms and editing software, of the patient, alchemical process of coaxing an image into existence. It was a world of observation, not participation. Caleb's life was lived in bright, primary colors. Mine was a study in grayscale, in the infinite and subtle gradations between black and white. The contrast felt right, stable. He was the sun, and I was the quiet planet that happened to be caught in his orbit, content to circle at a safe, predictable distance. The ache began so gradually I almost didn't notice it. It wasn't a sudden impact, but a slow erosion, the way water wears down stone over centuries. It was in the way he'd come home from a long trip, drop his bags by the door, and give me that blinding smile, saying, "God, it's good to be home." It was in the moments he'd wander into the kitchen while I was cooking, leaning against the counter and telling me about his day, his tie loosened, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows. He had a way of making you feel seen, of shining that high-wattage attention on you that made you feel, for a moment, like you were the only person in the room. I started to look forward to those moments, to the sound of his key in the lock, with a low, humming anticipation that I steadfastly refused to name. I was in love with him. It was a quiet, hopeless, and deeply inconvenient truth. It was a photograph I kept hidden, undeveloped, in the darkroom of my own mind, too afraid of what exposing it to the light might reveal. Loving Caleb felt like a form of madness, like falling in love with a photograph of the sun, all warmth and light and impossible distance. He was in a different universe, one with girlfriends and boisterous friends, and a future that ran on a set of tracks completely parallel to my own. To tell him, to even hint at it, would be to shatter the comfortable ecosystem of our friendship, to poison the well of our easy domesticity. It would make him uncomfortable, it would make him pull away, and the thought of our apartment silent and empty, of his light being withdrawn, was a far greater pain than the secret ache of my affection. So I guarded it. I built walls around it, soundproofed the room where it lived, and became a master of platonic camaraderie. I was his friend, his roommate. That was the role I had been assigned, and I was determined to play it perfectly. The shift, when it came, was not a gentle tremor but a seismic event. It was a Tuesday evening in October, the air outside just beginning to carry the crisp, mournful scent of autumn. I was in my room, editing a series of portraits, lost in the familiar digital dance of adjusting contrast and saturation. I heard the front door open and close, but it was too soft, too hesitant to be Caleb. Caleb arrived like a contained weather system. This was something else. A few minutes later, a soft knock came at my door. It was him, but a version of him I had never seen before. He was pale, his usually bright eyes shadowed and hollow. His perfect shirt was rumpled, his tie was gone, and he looked as though the structural integrity that held him together had been compromised. "Hey," he said, his voice a rough, unfamiliar thing. Can I come in?" I swiveled in my chair, my heart doing a slow, painful lurch in my chest. Of course. Everything okay? He didn't answer right away. He walked into the room and just stood there for a moment, looking at the contact sheets pinned to my corkboard, though I could tell he wasn't really seeing them. He was adrift. Finally, he sank onto the edge of my bed, ran a hand through his hair, and stared at the floor. Sarah and I, he started, then stopped. He took a breath. We broke up. The words hung in the air between us, heavy and strange. Sarah and Caleb. They were a fixed point in my understanding of the universe, a geographical feature on the map of his life. Their breakup felt like an act of cartographic violence. I didn't know what to say. The usual platitudes felt like cheap, flimsy things in the face of his obvious pain. So I said the only true thing I could think of. "I'm sorry, Caleb." He nodded, still not looking at me. She said we wanted different things. That I was complacent. That we were just going through the motions. He let out a short, bitter laugh that sounded like breaking glass. For years, just gone, he finally looked up at me, and his eyes were full of a raw, bewildered hurt that made me want to look away, to give him the privacy of his grief. But he was looking at me, really looking, as if searching for something. An anchor, maybe. A landmark in a suddenly unfamiliar country. I stayed perfectly still, meeting his gaze, trying to project a sense of solidity I was very far from feeling. In that moment, I wasn't his roommate, and I wasn't the man secretly in love with him. I was just the only other person in the room. I don't want to be alone right now," he whispered, and the sound was so fragile it nearly broke me. "You're not," I said, and my own voice sounded steadier than I expected. "Stay here. As long as you need." He stayed in my room for hours that night, sitting on my bed while I pretended to work, the silence punctuated only by the click of my mouse and the occasional, ragged sigh from him. We didn't talk much more. There was nothing to say. I just provided a quiet space for his pain to exist in, a room where he didn't have to perform or explain or pretend. When he finally stood up to leave, his movements were slow, weighted down. At my door, he paused and turned back. "Thanks, Leo," he said, and in his eyes, I saw a flicker of something new, a kind of raw, unguarded gratitude that felt more intimate than any conversation we'd ever had. That was the night the foundation shifted. The night the familiar landscape of our friendship began to tilt on its axis, and I felt the terrifying, exhilarating sensation of the ground giving way beneath my feet. That night was the beginning of the ritual. It started innocently enough. In the weeks that followed his breakup, Caleb seemed to shrink. The vibrant, confident energy that had once filled our apartment receded, leaving behind a quiet, restless ghost. He stopped going out with his friends, his evenings spent on the couch, staring blankly at the television, a beer sweating, forgotten, on the coffee table. He was adrift in the wreckage of his old life, and he seemed to have forgotten how to swim. I found myself becoming his unwilling, unacknowledged lifeguard. I would cook dinner and just wordlessly place a plate in front of him. I would suggest a movie, something stupid and loud that required no emotional investment, just to fill the oppressive silence of the apartment. He started falling asleep on the couch. At first, it would be late, after hours of channel surfing, his head lolling to the side, his body finally succumbing to the emotional exhaustion of the day. I would gently nudge him awake, tell him to go to his bed. He would mumble an apology, stumble to his room, and close the door, leaving me alone with the static of the television and the frantic, hopeful beating of my own heart. But then, one night, he didn't just nod off. He listed sideways, a slow, deliberate collapse, until his head came to rest on my shoulder. It was the moment from the beginning, the moment that would later become the first frame of this new story. The shock of it was electric. My entire body went rigid. I held my breath, listening, waiting for him to realize what he'd done, to jolt awake and pull back with a muttered, embarrassed apology. But he didn't. He just sighed, a deep, shuddering exhalation of pure weariness, and settled more firmly against me, his body molding to mine as if he had a right to be there. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, my mind a screaming chaos of panic and a wild, forbidden joy. This was a line. A clear, undeniable line had been crossed, and he was the one who had crossed it, albeit in the plausible deniability of sleep. Slowly, painstakingly, I forced myself to relax. I let my muscles unlock, let my breathing deepen to match his. I focused on the sensory details, anchoring myself to the reality of the moment. The scent of his shampoo, a clean, sandalwood fragrance. The surprising weight of his head on my shoulder, solid and real. The faint warmth radiating through his shirt into my arm. It was a kind of exquisite torture. Every nerve ending was on high alert, cataloging the data of his proximity, while my heart hammered out a frantic, desperate rhythm against my ribs. I wanted to stay in that moment forever, and I wanted to flee from it. After an hour, my shoulder began to ache, my leg fell asleep, but I didn't move. I couldn't. I had become his anchor, and I was terrified that if I shifted, he would drift away again. This became our new normal. Movie nights on the couch that ended with him asleep against me. I learned to anticipate it, to position myself in a way that would be more comfortable for the long haul. I became an expert in stillness, a connoisseur of the subtle shifts and sounds of another person's sleep. It was a strange, liminal space we inhabited on those nights, a territory that was no longer just friendship, but was not yet anything more. It was a silent agreement, an unspoken understanding built on his need for comfort and my inability to deny him. I told myself it was platonic, a friend helping another friend through a hard time. But in the quiet darkness of the living room, with his breath warm against my neck, I knew it was a lie. This was something else. This was the slow, dangerous process of developing a photograph in a darkroom with no idea what image would ultimately emerge. The ritual escalated on a cold night in November. A storm was raging outside, the wind rattling the window panes like an angry ghost. Caleb had been particularly quiet all day, withdrawn and haunted. I knew he had seen Sarah that afternoon, a meeting to exchange the last of their things, a final, formal severing. Around 2 in the morning, I was woken by a sound from the hallway. A choked, desperate gasp. I sat up in bed, my heart instantly pounding. I slipped out of my room and saw him standing in the dim light of the hallway, leaning against the wall, his face pale and slick with sweat. "Caleb," I whispered, "are you okay?" He looked at me, his eyes wide and unfocused. "Nightmare," he rasped. It was so real, I could see him trembling. He looked like a child, lost and terrified of the dark. The professional, competent Caleb Jacobs was gone, replaced by this raw, vulnerable stranger. My own carefully constructed walls crumbled in the face of his fear. "Come on," I said, my voice softer than I intended. "Let's get you some water." In the kitchen, he leaned against the counter, drinking the water in shaky sips while I watched him, my chest tight with a painful, protective ache. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He just stared into the sink as if it held the answers to some profound question. "I hate this, Leo," he said, his voice thick. "I hate feeling like this. Like I'm untethered." "I know," I said. It was all I could offer. He finished the water and placed the glass in the sink with a soft click. He still didn't move. The silence stretched, filled only by the sound of the rain lashing against the windows. "Can I?" he started, then hesitated, his gaze still fixed on the sink. "This is going to sound stupid. Nothing sounds stupid at 2 in the morning, I promised." He finally looked at me, his expression a mixture of shame and desperation. Will you just sit in my room for a bit? Until I fall back asleep?" The idea of going back in there alone." His voice trailed off, but I understood. The room was haunted by memories, by the ghost of a 4-year relationship. To be alone in there now was to be alone with the full weight of his loss. Every rational part of my brain screamed at me to say no, to make an excuse, to maintain the boundary that was already so dangerously blurred. It was one thing to offer a shoulder on a neutral couch. It was another thing entirely to cross the threshold into the intimacy of his bedroom. That was a different territory, a more sacred and dangerous ground. "Of course," I heard myself say. I followed him to his room. The space felt charged, foreign. His scent was stronger here, a mix of that sandalwood shampoo and clean laundry and something that was uniquely, indefinably him. I perched awkwardly on the corner of the armchair in the corner while he climbed back into bed, pulling the covers up to his chin. He watched me from the pillows, his eyes dark in the dim light filtering in from the hallway. "You don't have to sit all the way over there," he said, his voice muffled by the comforter. You can sit on the bed. If you want." My breath caught in my throat. It was an invitation, casual and yet monumental. I moved slowly, as if through deep water, and sat on the edge of the mattress, my back to him, facing the door. I could feel the warmth of his body through the thick comforter, a magnetic pull I had to actively resist. We sat in silence for a long time. I listened as his breathing, initially ragged and anxious, began to slow, to deepen. The trembling subsided. I was a human dream catcher, a talisman against the ghosts that haunted his sleep. When I was finally sure he was asleep, I stood up, my joints stiff, and began to tiptoe out of the room. "Leo," his voice, thick with sleep, stopped me at the door. I turned. His eyes were barely open. "Don't go," he murmured. "Please, stay." It wasn't a question. It was a plea, and it was the most devastatingly beautiful thing I had ever heard. I walked back to the bed, and this time, I didn't just sit on the edge. I laid down on top of the covers, on my side, my back to him, leaving a careful, deliberate foot of space between us. A DMZ of plausible deniability. I lay there, rigid and awake, for the rest of the night, listening to the steady, peaceful sound of his breathing, a lighthouse in the storm of my own emotions. I was drowning, and he was the one who thought he needed saving. That night established the final, most intimate phase of our ritual. It didn't happen every night, but it happened often enough to become a pattern. After a hard day at work, after a phone call that left him sounding hollow, or sometimes for no reason at all, he would appear at my door late at night, a silent, hopeful question in his eyes. And I would go. I would lie down on top of his covers, a dutiful sentinel, and I would stay until the dawn broke, painting the sky in shades of gray and bruised purple. We never spoke of it in the morning. We would pass in the kitchen, making coffee, and it was as if nothing had happened. We would talk about work, about the weather, about whose turn it was to take out the recycling. The nights were a separate reality, a secret, shared space that existed outside the rules of our waking lives. I lived for those nights. I began to feel like a creature of the dark, my true life beginning only after the sun went down. My own bed grew cold, a place of restless solitude. His room, his bed, even the carefully maintained distance between us, felt more like home. I learned the topography of his sleep in intimate detail. I learned that he sometimes mumbled names from work, that he kicked the covers off when he got too warm, that he always turned towards the warmth in the room, towards me. Sometimes, in the deepest hours of the night, he would shift, and an arm would be thrown across my back, a leg would tangle with mine. Each accidental touch was a jolt, a spark that lit up my entire nervous system. I would lie perfectly still, my heart a trapped bird beating against my ribs, until he shifted away again, leaving my skin tingling where he had touched me. I was living in a state of suspended disbelief. My analytical mind, the part of me that framed and composed the world, tried to find a rational explanation. He was grieving. He was lonely. He was using me as a human security blanket, a warm body to ward off the ghosts. It had nothing to do with me, not really. I was an object of convenience, a tool for his own emotional healing. This was the narrative I clung to, the story that allowed me to function. Because the alternative, the fragile, terrifying hope that it might mean more, that he might feel even a fraction of what I felt, was too dangerous to entertain. Hope was a high-exposure photograph, beautiful and blinding, but one that could burn out completely if you let in too much light. So I stayed in the darkroom, carefully managing the process, telling myself I was in control. The breaking point came on a Saturday in early spring. The world outside was tentatively waking up, the trees on our street blushing with the first hints of green. Caleb had spent the week on a business trip, and the apartment had been cavernously silent without him. I hadn't realized how much I had come to depend on his presence, on the low hum of his existence, until it was gone. When he came home that afternoon, he looked exhausted, but he gave me that familiar, brilliant smile that made my stomach swoop. "God, it's good to be home," he said, dropping his bags. The words were the same ones he'd always used, but they landed differently now. They felt heavier, more meaningful. That night, we didn't even pretend to watch a movie. We just talked. He told me about his trip, about the meetings and the soulless hotel rooms. I told him about a new project I was working on, a series of portraits of elderly couples. The conversation was easy, comfortable, the way it had been before Sarah, but threaded through with the new, unspoken intimacy of our nights. Around midnight, a comfortable silence fell between us. He was lying on one end of the couch, his head propped on the armrest, and I was on the other, our feet almost touching in the middle. He was quiet for so long that I thought he might have fallen asleep. But then he spoke, his voice soft in the quiet room. "Leo." "Yeah," I said, my voice equally low. He turned his head to look at me. His eyes, in the dim light from the street lamp outside, were dark and serious. He looked at me for a long time, a searching, intense gaze that felt like it was stripping away all my carefully constructed defenses. I felt completely exposed, pinned by his stare. "Can I ask you something?" he said. His voice was steady, but I could see a muscle twitching in his jaw. "Anything," I breathed. He didn't break eye contact. The air in the room grew thick, heavy. I could hear my own pulse, a frantic drumming in my ears. This felt different. This wasn't the hazy, sleep-blurred plea of a nightmare. This was conscious. This was awake. This was real. "Would it be okay," he started, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "if I kissed you?" The world stopped. The sound of the city outside, the hum of the refrigerator, the very air in my lungs, it all ceased to exist. There was only his question, hanging between us, a fragile, impossible bridge thrown across the chasm of everything we had never said. My mind went completely blank. The photographer, the observer, the man who always had an internal monologue running, was silent. There were no words, only a feeling of falling and being caught, all at the same time. I couldn't form a word, so I just nodded. A small, jerky movement that felt like it took all the strength I had. He moved slowly, deliberately. He pushed himself up from the couch and crossed the small space between us. He knelt on the floor in front of me, his hands coming up to rest gently on the cushion on either side of my legs. He was still looking at me, his eyes asking for confirmation, giving me one last chance to retreat. I didn't. I leaned forward, closing the final inch between us. His lips were softer than I could have imagined. The kiss was not passionate or demanding. It was a question. It was a confession. It was a quiet, tentative exploration, a mapping of new territory. It was the taste of coffee and uncertainty and a profound, bone-deep relief. It was the feeling of a door, one I had been leaning against for a year, finally swinging open. I brought a hand up to cup his jaw, my thumb stroking the rough stubble, and I felt a tremor run through him. The kiss deepened slightly, a mutual, unspoken agreement. This is real. This is happening. When he finally pulled back, it was only by a few inches. He rested his forehead against mine, his eyes closed. We stayed like that, just breathing the same air, for a long, silent moment. "Okay," he whispered, a single word that held a universe of meaning. It meant discovery. It meant acceptance. It meant, perhaps, the beginning of an answer. "Okay," I whispered back. And for the first time in a very long time, the quiet observer felt like he was finally part of the picture. The aftermath was not the gentle, sunlit dawn I had foolishly allowed myself to imagine. It was a stark, cold morning after a storm, the landscape littered with the debris of a shattered status quo. The beautiful, honest silence we had shared after the kiss evaporated with the morning light, replaced by a tense, crackling static. Caleb was a ghost in our own apartment. He was up and gone before I woke up, a half-empty coffee mug in the sink the only evidence he had been there at all. When he came home at night, he was distracted, his eyes skittering away from mine, his answers to my questions clipped and monosyllabic. He would retreat to his room and close the door, a solid, definitive click that echoed the slamming of a door in my own heart. The open door, the unspoken invitation, was gone. The ritual was broken. And with it, so was I. I felt a fool. A naive, hopeful idiot who had mistaken a moment of lonely confusion for something real. The photographer in me, the analyst, went into overdrive, re-examining the evidence. I replayed the kiss, the question that preceded it, the look in his eyes. I developed and redeveloped the memory, searching for a flaw in the negative, a sign that I had misinterpreted the light. But the image remained clear. It had been real. His vulnerability had been real. His tentative hope had been real. So what had changed? The silence stretched for 3 agonizing days. 3 days of living with a polite, distant stranger who wore my roommate's face. The apartment, which had become a sanctuary, a space of quiet intimacy, now felt like a cage. The air was thick with unspoken words, with the ghost of that kiss. I felt it on my lips every time I saw him. I could see the memory of it in the way he refused to look at me. By the 3rd night, I couldn't bear it anymore. The uncertainty was a corrosive acid, eating away at the fragile new hope I had allowed to grow. I knew that confrontation was a risk, that it might be the thing that shattered our friendship for good. But living in this limbo, this suffocating space between what had happened and what was happening now, was a slower, more painful kind of death. I found him in the kitchen, staring out the window at the city lights, his shoulders slumped. He looked just as miserable as I felt. "Caleb," I said, my voice quiet but firm. He flinched, but he didn't turn around. "Hey, we need to talk about this," I said. I walked closer, stopping a few feet behind him. I can't live in the space between. This silence is louder than any argument we could ever have." He finally turned to face me, and the raw panic in his eyes was a physical blow. He looked cornered, terrified. "Leo, he ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I now recognized as a sign of profound distress. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have. That night was a mistake. The word was a clean, sharp blade. It cut through all the soft, hopeful tissue and went straight for the bone. I felt the blood drain from my face, but I held my ground. I had to know. I owed myself the truth, no matter how much it hurt. "Was it?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm. "Was it a mistake when you asked me? Was it a mistake when you kissed me? Or is it only a mistake now, in the daylight?" "It's not that simple," he shot back, his voice rising with frustration. "You don't understand, then make me understand," I pleaded, my own voice finally breaking. "Because from where I'm standing, it feels like you took something from me, something I didn't even know I had to give, and now you want to pretend it never happened. You don't get to do that. You don't get to use my shoulder to sleep on for months. You don't get to ask me into your bed because you're scared of the dark, and you sure as hell don't get to kiss me like you mean it, and then decide it was a mistake." The words tumbled out of me, a torrent of all the pain and confusion and frustration I had been holding back. He stared at me, his face pale, his mouth slightly agape. He looked like I had physically struck him. "I'm scared," he whispered, the fight going out of him completely. He sagged against the counter, his bravado crumbling to dust. "Leo, I don't know what this is. When I was with Sarah, it was easy. It was what was supposed to happen. You meet a girl, you fall in love, you build a life. It's a roadmap. Everyone has a copy of it. But this with you, there's no map. I don't know where this road goes, and it terrifies me." He looked up at me, his eyes swimming with a desperate, honest confusion. "That kiss wasn't a mistake. That's what's so terrifying. It felt more real than anything I felt with her for the last year. It felt like coming home after being lost for a very long time. And I have no idea what to do with that feeling. So I ran. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I hurt you." His confession, messy and frightened and painfully real, was not the clean resolution I might have wanted, but it was something far more valuable. It was the truth. He wasn't rejecting me. He was struggling with himself, with a fundamental shift in his own understanding of who he was. The anger drained out of me, replaced by a wave of profound, aching empathy. He wasn't the confident, unknowing initiator anymore. He was just as lost in this as I was. I closed the distance between us, and, for the first time, I was the one to initiate. I reached out and took his hand. His fingers were cold, but they curled around mine instantly, his grip tight and desperate. "So we're both scared," I said softly, looking down at our joined hands. Okay, we can start there. We don't need a map, Caleb. We need to be willing to get lost together. He looked up at me, a single tear tracing a path down his cheek. He nodded, a small, hopeful movement. Okay, he whispered. Okay. It was the same word he had spoken after our first kiss, but this time it felt different. It wasn't a word of discovery. It was a word of commitment, a promise to try. The resolution was not a sudden, cinematic swell of music. It was a slow, quiet process, as patient and deliberate as developing a photograph in a darkroom. We began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we'd learned to create together, but this time it wasn't a silence of unspoken longing, but one of mutual understanding. We talked. We had awkward, fumbling conversations about our fears, about our pasts, about what this new, fragile thing between us might become. He told me about the pressure he'd always felt to follow a certain path, the one laid out for the college athlete, the successful professional. I told him about the safety I'd always found behind my camera, the fear of stepping into the frame of my own life. We were two people who had been living in carefully constructed rooms, and for the first time, we were showing each other the floor plans. The physical intimacy returned, but it was different now. It was intentional. The first night after our talk, he didn't appear at my door as a ghost. He came and stood there, fully awake and fully present, and simply asked, "Can I sleep in your room tonight?" Not his room, haunted by the past, but mine. A neutral ground. A new beginning. When he got into my bed, he didn't stay on his side. He turned to face me, and I opened my arms, and he came to rest against my chest, his head tucked under my chin. There was no pretense, no plausible deniability. It was a conscious, deliberate act of seeking and giving comfort. I held him, feeling the steady, reassuring beat of his heart against mine, and I knew that this was real. This was the foundation. Our apartment transformed again. The tension dissipated, replaced by a soft, humming energy of domestic peace. We fell into new rhythms. The morning coffee ritual was now accompanied by a soft kiss. Cooking dinner became a shared activity, our bodies brushing past each other in the narrow kitchen with an easy, familiar grace. We learned the language of each other's touch, a hand on the small of the back in passing, fingers intertwined while we watched television, a foot seeking out the other under the covers in the middle of the night. These small, constant points of contact were a conversation in themselves, a reaffirmation of the choice we were making every day, to be here, together, in this space we had built. One rainy Sunday afternoon, I found Caleb sitting on the floor of my room, a box of my old photographs in his lap. These were my personal prints, not for clients, the ones I kept hidden away. They were landscapes, abstract studies of light, and a few self-portraits from my college years that made me cringe. He was looking at one in particular, a stark black and white shot of a single, empty doorway, the light pouring in from an unseen source. "I like this one," he said quietly, without looking up. "It feels hopeful, like you don't know what's on the other side, but the light makes you want to find out." I sat down on the floor next to him, my shoulder brushing his. I looked at the photograph, an image I had taken a decade ago, feeling lost and uncertain about my own future. I was always afraid to walk through doors like that, I confessed. It was always safer to stay where I was, to just take the picture of it. He turned his head and looked at me, his gaze soft and full of an affection that still made my heart ache in the best possible way. He reached out and tucked a stray piece of hair behind my ear, his fingers warm against my skin. "You're not just the photographer anymore, Leo," he said. "You're in the picture with me now." He leaned in and kissed me, a slow, gentle kiss that tasted of contentment and rainy afternoons and the quiet certainty of being exactly where you were supposed to be. It wasn't a question anymore. It was an answer. It was a statement. It was the beautiful, undeniable truth of us. There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. A roommate falling asleep on your shoulder, a whispered plea in a darkened hallway, a shared glance over morning coffee. They don't announce themselves as pivotal. They are quiet, subtle, written in the language of gesture and proximity. For a year, I lived beside a man who was a stranger to his own heart. and I was a man who was a stranger to his own hope. We were two separate worlds, orbiting a shared space, until a moment of crisis collapsed the distance between us. We found each other not in a grand declaration, but in the small, repeated rituals of care, in the silent admission of need. We began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we'd learned to create together, building a new language word by word, touch by touch, until the four walls of our apartment were no longer just a place to live, but the foundation of a life. The love I had been searching for, the safe harbor I never thought I'd find, had been there all along, breathing quietly beside me in the dark, waiting for both of us to be brave enough to open our eyes in the morning and see what was truly there.